I don't attract people who are stingy with the pricing, I attract people who want the job done properly. Is a wall vegan friendly? Couldn't say. I basically try and always promote to do what is right for the customer. Okay, Blaine Gray here, Plastering For Beginners, and today we're going to do a Q&A where we answer your biggest questions in plastering and try and find out the answers to what's real and what's not. First question on this phone is, can you use bonding on high suction backgrounds if you PVA the surface beforehand? I think you can, but not sure. Good question. The previous video I've just done at the weekend, I basically outlined how to skim and patch up exposed brickwork, blown areas of plaster, and I basically highlight the differences between two undercoat plasters most commonly used in the UK. You've got British Gypsum Bonding and British Gypsum Hardwell. Now, basically, rule of thumb is Hardwell plaster is used on brickwork, blockwork, anything with a high suction. Bonding is used on areas of medium to low suction backgrounds like existing walls, blown plaster where you've got the undercoat remaining, plasterboard even. That's where you use bonding. You wouldn't use Hardwell on existing walls or plasterboard. You wouldn't use bonding plaster on brickwork. That's a general rule of thumb. That's the differences between the two. Now, with that in mind though, you can PVA bricks and that way it'll seal the brickwork and then use bonding on top of it. I've done it before, it does work and it doesn't leave a major mess and it doesn't fall off. The only problem with that is Hardwell is a stronger, more solid product. Bonding is quite soft. Because of the way it dries, because it hasn't had its moisture pulled out of itself, it's quite soft and it's generally not as hard as Hardwell. So that's why for brickwork you should always use Hardwell plaster. It's just a stronger product and it does grip itself a lot better to the brickworks compared to bonding does. So you can use PVA on bricks and then bond it out, but I don't know why you would. I wouldn't do it. Stick to Hardwell, that's the correct way of doing it. And by the way, it's a very interesting video on the differences and how to patch up blown plaster. I'll show you the link at the end of this video and we'll get right onto it. Do you never use a speed skim on base coat plaster? No. Speed skims are too flexible. Even though you're using it to flatten finished plaster, it's never going to work for base coats. Base coats need to have a solid material like metal. You can use a really tough plastic I suppose, but I wouldn't advise it. Proper strong metal, because this way it's not going to bend. Speed skims will bend under the weight of the render, they'll ripple around and you'll just not get a flat base. Where if you use something like a feather edge, a straight edge, you're going to ensure that base coat is dead flat, and that is what you need. It needs to be plumb, it needs to be flat, and you need to use something that's solid. Speed skims, no matter what they do say on the labelling you can use it. I don't care what span it is, I don't care if it's Raffina, I don't care if it's Ox, don't use them, just use proper metal straight edges. That's the one. It's an interesting one. This comes from a guy called Happy Truths. He leaves a lot of comments on the channel. Thanks for watching if you are listening. But this is about pricing up and clients if you're in the industry. So I'm not saying you're not doing a good job, because you are, but there is an issue with clients, and that is finding people who want to pay for all the prep compared to some spreads who rolls up to price and says he'll take the cracks and just reskim. Client looks at price differences and jumps on the cheaper reskims. I see this all the time when I'm pricing, so you either join them or you lose jobs. Okay, I've got two opinions on this. I like to do a job properly. It's my reputation, I'm self-employed. I get all my work from word of mouth pretty much. I don't advertise, and I basically rely on people spreading the word to each other. So if I look at a job, I'm just completely honest with the customer and I give them two options. I'll say what should happen. So for example, if it sounds like the plaster is drummy, if it sounds like the top layer needs to come back, then I'll tell them I think this area needs to be hacked off, it needs to be done again properly, it needs to be floated up, and it needs to be skimmed. But then I give them an alternative. I'll say, look, that's what I think should happen, because judging by the sound of the plaster, it seems like it's pulled itself away from the brickwork. Or we can take the cracks, just skim it and hope for the best. That way though, I'll give them the condition. I'll say, but if that happens, I can't guarantee the work, and I'll basically just say, if that does crack and fail, then it's not down to me. And I'll always give the conditions on what will happen if we don't do it properly, and that way they understand. I think the worst thing is with quoting jobs, we just assume that all customers understand what's going on, but they don't always know the different situations, they don't know what materials to use. So I'll just make it clear from the get-go what's happened to the wall, why the damage has been done, and the best way to go around it. And I give them options. I'll say, here's 2 quotes. Got this one where to do the job properly, comprehensively, and we've got this one which is a cheaper way around, which might work, or further down the line, it might lead to more problems. But basically, through this, 90% of the time, people will always go for the option that's the best for them, because they don't want the house to fall apart. They don't want cracks turning up later down the line. They want it to be done properly. So I don't agree with cheap methods, and I definitely don't advocate it. And I've found through that I've had a better client base, and generally I don't attract, without sounding harsh, I don't attract people who are stingy with the pricing. I attract people who want the job done properly, and as the name spreads, it gets spread to people who care about the quality of the houses. So that's what I say. I think if you're looking for a better work life, then do the job right. You'll have no callbacks, and essentially I believe you'll probably make a bit more money. This is the most random question I think I've ever received. Is a wall vegan friendly? Couldn't say. Probably with the confinements of what vegan means, probably not. I don't think there's pig in the render that I used. And I don't think there's milk in there. So I want to say yeah, but probably not. Who knows? But again, that is the best question I think I've received on this channel. That's just brilliant. I've only just stumbled across it. So I'm not sure. This is a rendering question. I can't seem to avoid circular sponge marks. How can I get over this? Okay, it's probably things here that it's going to affect how your sponging looks on the finish of the render. If you're doing the sponging and the floating too early, then what's going to happen is, if it's too wet, you're just basically going to move the render around and you're going to create ripples, circular motions, because it's just not dry enough yet. It's the same with the floating. If you start to float up the wall too soon, then the render isn't thick enough to start being compressed in itself. The render needs to be quite solid, and that way as you're floating up the aggregate, floating up the surface, it's going to compact itself a lot more. If it's wet, it's just going to pull itself from the brickwork and essentially make itself a bit weaker. So the first thing, the render does need to be substantially quite firm before you start any of the finishing process. So sponging when wet is a big no-go, is what's going to create these circular motions. 2, cleaning your sponge, constantly cleaning the sponge. The sand will sit in the pockets of the sponge, and then what it'll do is leaves rat tails, that's what we called it in New Zealand. It's where the sand creates lines in the render and you'll see the circular motions because it just cuts through it. So constantly keep your sponge clean, constantly keep tapping out the aggregate, constantly whack your sponge against the side. That way it's going to flick the sand out of itself and make it nice and clean. 3rd one, make sure your sponge is damp, not wet. So when you've cleaned out your sponge, drain all the water out of it, and you basically want your sponge to be virtually dry. And that way when you're sponging up on the surface of the render, there's no moisture there. It's not going to liven up the render, which will then, it'll bring the plasticizers to the front and it'll make itself creamier. We don't want that. We want a dry sponge, and that way all you're going to do with dry sponge is bring the aggregate to the surface, but you're not actually affecting any of the render itself. And that's when you're left with nice, smooth wall. So a dry sponge, render's got to be dry, and a clean sponge all the way through. They're the 3 points of success. And very light touch. When you're sponging, don't put any pressure on. You're literally just holding the edge of the sponge and as light as you can, sponging it up. That's what I recommend. So I've had a good few people asking what trowel I'm using. What trowel is it, please? Is it Anella Carbon? Yes, I'm using at the moment an Anella Premium Carbon trowel. I've gone back to carbon steel, and I must admit it's an absolute game changer. This one is about OCR actually. Now the great thing about using this render, which is OCR by Weber, is the fact that you can layer 2 coats in one sitting. So basically I'm applying this first coat here, very thick mind you, and using this pre-grip, which is the Seeker render grip. It's brilliant stuff, it just sticks to it like no problem. But the thing is, you can apply 2 layers 10 minutes after each other. It's called one coat render for a reason. Why are you applying it in 2 coats? You don't need to do a scratch coat, just hit it all in one go. I've had a few about this. OCR is generally used for pumps, so it's pumped onto the wall, and if it is pumped in, the pressure behind allows you to pump a high thickness into one sitting, and the way it clumps on the wall is the fact that it can just be kept there, and it can be built up to say 15 millimeters in one hit. Now when I'm hand applying it, I do it the same way I'd do it as if I was using Hardwell plaster, and I do it for 2 reasons. I do it in 2 coats. One is because the first pass, I'm going to apply a lot of pressure pushing into the brickwork. And then that way you're going to have a firm bond to the brick. If you just whack on 15mm of render in one go, there's no real pressure behind it. There's not enough pressure to push it into the brickwork and key itself in. The difference when you're spraying it, the amount of pressure you got before, it's really going to embed itself into the brickwork because of the pressure throwing itself into the wall itself. When you're hand applying at that thickness, you can't give it the pressure needed to give it the high strength and give it the full key and bond you're going to give it to deserve. So what I do is 2 passes, 1 tight coat, a lot of pressure behind, and that way you're going to have a real nice bond to the brickwork. Anything else on top of that, it's going to stick to the product and its own product well, but you've got a nice base to work on, and you've got a nice strong bond that isn't going to fail over time. So that's why I do it in 2 passes. It's for strength, and it's also the fact that OCR is supposed to be machine pumped at that level. And that's it. I think that's the end of the questions. I've got quite a few, still quite new to me, so leave your comments below. Did you like this? Is this still a good format? Did you find it useful? And like I said, going back to the original question, if you want to know the big differences between bonding and hardwall, find out the big ways to patch up plastering, and watch the most recent video I did here where I'll show you some really cool ways on how to use bonding and hardwall, and subscribe to the channel here. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.